Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at how railroads in the 19th and 20th centuries supplied water to their steam locomotives out on the line. We'll also explore the museum's working water tower. Today, this replica of a former Denver and Rio Grande Western tank is proudly displayed and used at the museum, helping to quench the thirst of iron horses here in Colorado. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today is water, and specifically how this important commodity was made available to keep steam locomotives running all across the land. Come join me now as we explore the subject of water, along with the creativity and ingenuity that helped ensure it would always be available, ready to use, alongside railroad tracks near and far. As America's earliest railroads extended their tracks further and further in the 1830s, the issue of supplying fuel and water over greater distances came into focus. The task of refilling a locomotive's water tank from trackside water sources was often tedious and time-consuming. Small barrels of water and piles of wood were placed alongside tracks to refill onboard boxes and tenders, or nearby streams were dammed or diverted into ponds. Train crews could use barrels and buckets or pump water by hand into locomotives. History does not record whose idea it was to place a trackside tank on an elevated platform, allowing gravity to do the refilling. But the railroad water tower made immediate sense, catching on early and quickly. It could be supplied by diverting upstream water sources and piping them to a tank, or a well could be dug to fill the tank, with a pump doing the heavy lifting. The size of locomotive tenders, at first quite small and lacking much capacity, grew through the Civil War. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, locomotive tenders carried 500 to 1,000 gallons of water. Water towers also grew in capacity, with tanks across Nebraska and Wyoming storing 15,000 gallons. Larger tanks holding as much as 30,000 gallons were placed at busy division points. By the late 19th century, wooden water tanks were a common part of the American landscape. They had also become fairly uniform in appearance. Each railroad tended to create its own standard design, but local conditions also helped dictate the size, shape, and design of a given water tank. Professional associations such as the ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, would further standardize water tank design to create basic parameters for form, function, and cost. Water towers, as they're commonly called, were not the only means of filling a locomotive tender. On a few busy eastern railroads operating fast trains between big cities such as New York and Chicago, track pans allowed locomotives to take on water without even stopping. These track pans required a long, level stretch of track. When a train came along, the fireman would drop a scoop underneath the tender, forcing water into the tender until it overflowed. The scoop would be raised and the train would continue on its way. Track pans were maintenance intensive and expensive to keep in operation, so they were reserved only for the busiest railroads. As you might imagine, Colorado never saw a single track pan. However, water columns, which came into use starting in the 1870s and 1880s, did become fairly common here. Known interchangeably as water columns or standpipes or water cranes, these took up less space in and around tracks. Typically, a nearby tank provided the supply for these water columns. In busy yards and at junctions, more than one column could even be plumbed to serve multiple tracks. They also could be easily relocated if the track arrangement was changed. In some instances, railroads took advantage of municipal water systems and had pressurized city water plumbed directly to these standpipes. This eliminated the need for a separate water tank completely. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1860s launched the era of railroad water towers in the Rocky Mountain region. Union Pacific tracks crossed arid plains, and impressive windmills were soon pumping water to supply the company's locomotives. which truly were engines of change. Starting in the 1870s, railroad water towers became a part of the Colorado landscape even before statehood was achieved. These tanks were hard to miss, not just because of their large size, but also because of the adjacent wells and windmills and other structures housing a variety of engines to drive the pumps over the years. Some of these installations were quaint, while others throughout the Midwest were just plain impressive. Because of where its lines ran, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe in particular had many challenges furnishing good quality water and enough of it to keep its busy routes humming. In the Rocky Mountains of Colorado and New Mexico, the Denver and Rio Grande and competitors such as the South Park Line had their hands full, especially at higher elevations. Wintry weather sometimes turned water tanks into some sort of mad scientist sculpture project. The good news was that water tended to be plentiful in the mountains and valleys. But the narrow gauge Rio Grande line to Santa Fe was challenged for water, as was the railroad's main line through much of Utah. As the diesel-electric locomotive took over on standard gauge lines, water tanks were phased out. The last ones operating in Colorado were, of course, found on the Rio Grande's narrow gauge San Juan extension, stretching from Alamosa to Chama, New Mexico, and onto Durango, south to Farmington, and north to Silverton. But even these lines were eventually abandoned or sold off, and most of the functioning water towers were allowed to slowly return to nature. Today, railroad water tanks and towers and columns are found throughout Colorado and surrounding states. Every tourist railroad that operates steam locomotives has one or more, and many are original structures that have seen major maintenance to keep them in repair. The Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, operating between Chama, New Mexico and Antonito, Colorado, boasts original water columns as well as water tanks at several points along its 64-mile route. The Durango and Silverton, operating between its namesake towns in southwestern Colorado, features several original water tanks. The Georgetown Loop Railroad, west of Denver, has a replica water tank in Silver Plume, its upper terminus. The Cripple Creek and Victor has created a scaled-down water tank to match its scaled-down railroad equipment. Several railroad museums and tourist railroads outside of Colorado proudly maintain original, relocated, and/or replica water tanks as well. If you keep an eye out for them, original railroad water tank can be found in all sorts of places here in the Centennial State and across the U.S. Occasionally, large tanks still stand alongside busy, diesel-powered mainline railroads, juxtaposing old and new. Perhaps most poignantly, water tanks and towers and columns can occasionally be found out in the middle of nowhere, standing sentinel over the memory of abandoned standard or narrow gauge rail lines. The idea behind a water tower, of course, was to have plenty of water available for the moment a locomotive needed its tender refilled. This meant the capacity of these towers had to consider all the locomotives that required refilling during a given period of time. After all, it would take time for the tank to refill itself, especially in arid locations with a well and a pump. But first, these tanks required a source for their water. Railroads needed to locate that source, then secure water rights for each location. The complexity of getting the water into a water tower or tank also varied greatly. This played out very differently in Colorado's mountains, for instance, than it did for railroads operating across the plains. For railroads operating in the arid American West, often the railroad companies also took on the role of water supplier to the small towns and settlements that sprang up along its tracks. On the eastern Colorado plains, water tended to be scarce, and it was rarely found on the surface. Digging a well was the answer. One perhaps 30 feet deep and 15 feet in diameter could be lined with stone or timber. Sometimes, though, the wells had to go down 100 feet or more to tap into a sufficient and dependable supply of water. Newer drilling technology made the job of sinking wells easier over the years. Next, the water had to be lifted out of the well and into the tank. The earliest power source was the plentiful Colorado wind. Railroads became major customers for windmill manufacturers such as Halliday and Fairbanks-Morse. Wind turned the windmill blades, in turn powering a pump, which was placed in the well itself near the water line. There was one drawback. If the winds didn't blow, the water didn't rise. As a result, steam boilers were added at many wells to ensure a steady supply of pumping power. At first, boilers and windmills often existed side by side to power the pump. Oil-fired engines and later gas-fired ones were substituted in the 20th century. Electricity took over the pumping job as overhead electric lines made their way into rural areas. Most windmills were phased out before the end of the steam locomotive era because of these advances. In the mountainous areas of Colorado, water stations generally didn't need pumps. Wells, cisterns, or small dams could be built along mountain creeks above the elevation of a water tank or water tower. Pipes would be installed so gravity could move the water into a tank. A simple float mechanism was often employed inside the tank with an exterior indicator to tell train crews how much water was in the tank. When a locomotive pulled to a stop, the fireman would climb onto the tender and pull a funnel, otherwise known as the spout, down from its upright position. The fireman then tugged on a rope, chain, or lever to open a valve, letting the water flow freely. The filling process was typically just a couple of minutes in length, ending when the tender overflowed. The water was shut off, the spout pushed back, and the train was free to resume its travel. It's not exactly a secret that winters in Colorado can get cold. Early railroad engineers had to contend with temperatures ranging from the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit and higher out on the plains to minus 30 degrees below zero, especially at higher elevations where snow accumulation can be significant. Water in the tanks, as well as all of the associated pipes and plumbing and pumps, had to be kept from freezing. Constant use of the water by locomotives was important. If the water in the tank was being regularly emptied and then replaced, it typically did not have an opportunity to freeze. However, many railroad tanks in Colorado also needed frost boxes built into their structures. These wood-framed rooms underneath or next to the tanks housed the fill pipes and any other piping. Typically, these were well insulated with 6 to 10-inch walls filled with sawdust. The Denver and Rio Grande in particular also built ceilings on some of its mountain water tanks, with the space between the roof and the tank ceiling acting as an insulated space. All of this freeze protection sometimes wasn't enough. In a few extremely cold and exposed locations, including Rawlins Pass on the Denver and Salt Lake and Boreas Pass and Alpine Tunnel on the South Park line, water tanks were built into snow sheds for added protection. And during the winter, the Rio Grande and the Colorado and Southern both equipped their locomotives with special steam hoses. These could quickly thaw frozen water tank outlet pipes and valves. One final factor was encountered in the furnishing of water for steam locomotives. The water itself needed to be relatively high in quality and soft in character. Otherwise, mineral deposits would build up on the locomotive boiler tubes and piping and greatly increase maintenance and repair. Water with high mineral content also tended to foam, reducing the boiler's efficiency and making it difficult for engine crews to safely and properly operate their locomotives. Early in the 20th century, as the size, power output, and speed of locomotives increased, railroads began installing water treatment plants at water stops. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe in particular operated through regions where water quality often was poor. The railroad maintained a modern laboratory in Topeka where samples from each well were sent. After testing, a recipe for treating the water at each location was created, using soda ash and lime to soften water through a mixing process. Treatment plants consisted of yet another water tank, typically slightly taller than the water tower itself. Raw water was pumped into the mixing tank where it came into contact with the soda ash and lime. The unwanted minerals precipitated out, and the softened water then overflowed from the top of the mixing tank into the actual storage tank. Sometimes this entire system was incorporated into a single steel tower containing multiple tanks. Around 1964, the Colorado Railroad Museum erected a water tower to use in filling the tender of its operating steam locomotive, Denver and Rio Grande Western No. 346. A small pump house building was constructed immediately adjacent. The end of track at that time was just a few feet to the east. If there was a specific prototype for this early water tower, it's been lost to history. Nothing quite like it appears to have ever served a Colorado railroad. The museum's first water tank was built out of wood, and just as with the originals, it required maintenance that wasn't always forthcoming. After 30-plus years, it needed a complete makeover. In 2008, the tank was completely rebuilt, and an internal plastic liner was added to help stop leakage and simplify future maintenance. It's officially known today as the Headington Tank in honor of generous contributors who made the rebuilding possible. This replacement water tower was modeled on two 9,600-gallon water towers dating from the late 1940s. These rather late-in-history tanks, which were unique to the Rio Grande's narrow-gauge network, replaced older water towers that were badly deteriorated. One of these smaller tanks graced a water stop known as Jack's Cabin, located north of Gunnison on the railroad's branch to Crested Butte. A second, identical tank was situated at Villa Grove, south of Mears Junction, on the Rio Grande narrow-gauge line between Alamosa and Salida. Because good water quality is especially important for historic locomotives, the museum monitors and treats the water used in its boilers. Unlike with the operating railroads in their heyday, however, water treatment is done here in Golden by adding necessary treatment compounds to the locomotive tender tank directly, after it's been filled. This is simply a practical measure, since the museum operates steam locomotives relatively infrequently. To confuse things just a bit, there's another little story about the museum's water tower. A few years after it was first installed, museum founder Bob Richardson decided to name the water stop No Agua, in honor of a former Denver and Rio Grande watering stop. Signs proudly proclaim this name today. The record isn't clear, but we suspect Richardson figured the name would cause puzzlement among museum guests. It still leads to questions even today. So what's the history behind the No Agua name? In 1880, the Denver and Rio Grande's Chile line was being constructed from Antonito, Colorado to Espanola, New Mexico. About 34 miles south of Antonito, the first water stop was constructed at a station named No Agua. It wasn't that water was completely lacking at this location, but rather it was scarce. On the positive side, the scarce water was judged to be good, meaning that it did not require treatment. The railroad built a standard wooden 50,000-gallon tank across from the depot platform at No Agua. The well at this location was over 40 feet deep and 6 feet in diameter. A Halliday windmill on a 51-foot tall tower was erected to power the pump. For whatever reason, the tank was completely replaced just 7 years later, and in 1901, a Decorah windmill with steel blades replaced the earlier wooden Halliday model. The No Agua water tower was removed completely in the early 1920s and not replaced, meaning there really was no agua after that time. Even though the museum's water tower today looks nothing like the much larger one which originally graced No Agua, New Mexico, this unique name still graces the museum's adjacent pump shed. Thanks for joining me today. Colorado's railroads played critical roles in developing water resources so transportation could reach ever farther across the plains and into the mountains. I hope you've enjoyed our quick look at the history and function of the once common water tower and its cousins, and especially our No Agua tank that still playfully attracts attention here in Golden. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.